Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to share with you my presentation on green growth, carbon neutrality, and green recovery, and reflect on the international cooperation opportunities, and particularly the role of Korea. So for those of you who don't know, the Global Green Growth Institute is a treaty-based intergovernmental organization headquartered here in Seoul, and the large majority of our staff actually don't work in Seoul, but in our member countries. GGGI now has 43 member countries, and about 80% of our 500 staff and consultants work in more than 35 member and partner countries around the world. We support our member countries to accelerate their transition to a green economic growth development model. Today I'd like to reflect on the unprecedented sustainability crisis that we lived through. Of course, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, but there are many other signs that our life has become unsustainable. The most prominent of these is, of course, the climate crisis. And I'd like to reflect a bit on the priorities that were set at COP26 in Glasgow last year, summarized by the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson as coal, cars, cash, and trees. To that, I would like to add jobs as a particularly important priority caused by the socio-economic crisis as a result of the pandemic, and then the opportunities for a green recovery and GGGI's opportunity to support all these priorities for its member countries. Indeed, we are living through an unprecedented sustainability crisis, not least climate change, but many other simultaneous sustainability crises at the same time. And yes, the climate crisis has become a reality for all of us, but particularly for the more than 20 million climate refugees that the world now knows every year, particularly as a result of floods and droughts. That is the background against which coal, cars, cash and trees were the top priorities at the Glasgow COP26. And yes, there GGGI had worked with many of its member and partner countries to come up with stronger NDCs, stronger commitments to reduce both the impacts of climate change through increased resilience and reduce the emissions of climate change to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Coal, the first priority mentioned by the British Prime Minister. Coal is the worst culprit, the dirtiest fuel, and while in the US and EU the use of coal has started to reduce quite significantly, coal unfortunately is not dead, but can be said to have moved to Asia. Asia is the continent where the largest number of new coal-fired power plants is still in the planning and construction phase, and Asia will likely add another 100 coal-fired power plants in the coming years if we can't stop those developments. I believe that reducing the use of coal in Asia is probably the most important topic for climate change in the world, and certainly in Asia. There are alternatives to coal. In India, we work on a very large floating solar project, for example, 600 megawatt, and it just shows that in addition to using land, which is scarce in Korea and often cited as one of the reasons why solar power can't be expanded as rapidly as politicians would like, there are alternatives. For instance, to use the surfaces of reservoirs to put solar panels. And also food waste. Food waste is, of course, a big problem in many countries, and rather than have food waste go to landfills, as is still the place in too many countries. You can turn organic waste into biogas, and at a larger scale, potentially even into bio-CNG, replacing the liquid natural gas that is currently imported from particularly countries in the Middle East and Australia. Coal and then cars. Cars are another particular priority. Transportation is a particularly large contributor to the climate crisis, and changing from internal combustion engine cars to electric cars looks like it has become a priority that has come within reach much more rapidly than we would have imagined a few years ago. And for big car producers in Korea, this is a particularly important opportunity. And Hyundai indeed has committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Of course, not all cars can be electric. For some of the heavier vehicles like buses, electric buses might still be an option, and countries like Nepal have come up with national e-mobility plans, not only for climate reasons, but also because the capital, Kathmandu, is suffering from air pollution, and electric buses may help bring back both blue skies and net zero in the fight against climate change. In addition to electric vehicles, though, we are expecting hydrogen to play a role to decarbonize trucks and potentially maritime transport as well, and other hard to decarbonize sectors of the economy, such as industry. And while electric vehicles have become close to price competitive with internal combustion engines, green hydrogen, hydrogen produced by turning renewable energy into hydrogen, has not yet become price competitive. That is potentially the most important research and development challenge for the next 10 years. Korea is particularly interested in green hydrogen, and GGGI has signed an MOU with KOGAS, the very large Korean gas company, to attempt to develop green hydrogen projects in GGGI member countries that have ample renewable energy available to do so, such as Indonesia, which is one of the first countries where geothermal energy may be used to produce green hydrogen. Coal, cars, and cash. The critical element for the climate discussions between developed and developing countries is the promise of developed countries to provide at least 100 billion per annum in funding for developing countries to make the green transition, and the fact that by 2020 that amount had not yet been achieved. With the doubling of climate finance by the Biden administration, as promised last year, that commitment may be reached in 2022, but this is still one of the hot discussion items in all the climate debates. And not only because the total amount has not really been achieved at the level that was promised some time ago. In part it is because that level of 100 billion is far less than what will be necessary to really win the climate crisis in developing countries, and because the large majority of the funding to date has all focused on mitigation and only a very small share on adaptation. And as developing countries are already hard hit by climate impacts, increasing the share of adaptation in the total climate finance has become a top priority. GGGI supports its members to not only develop climate policies, but then turn those into bankable projects and mobilize green and climate finance. It's probably the most important contribution that GGGI has made for its developing and emerging economy members. We helped mobilize about $2 billion in the period of 2015 to 2020, and we were very pleased that we were able to mobilize an additional $5 billion last year for a total of $7 billion. Now that is not enough to close the climate finance gap, but it shows that green development projects can be commercially attractive, as a relatively large share of that $7 billion has not come from governments or development assistance, but has come from the private sector. And that's the area that will have to be expanded the most if we are to solve the climate crisis. We believe that carbon finance, trading carbon credits, is a particularly interesting new opportunity now that in COP26 the Article 6 rulebook was completed. And for countries like Korea, if indeed Korea is to reduce its emissions by 2030 to 40%, probably a significant share of that reduction will have to be purchased internationally. The GGGI has a large program to build capacity in developing countries, like say Indonesia, that could be a partner for Korea to produce excess carbon credits in Indonesia, but could be traded to Korea. Those kind of examples we hope to expand in the years to come, and we believe that that could be an important service where GGGI could become a carbon transaction platform for both its buying and selling members. So finally, coal, cars, cash and trees. The final subject that Boris Johnson emphasized was that there ought to be many more investments in nature-based solutions, which is one of the most effective ways to deal with not only climate change, but the biodiversity crisis as well. So this is an older report from a few years ago that shows that there is an enormous potential by investing in reforestation or avoided forest conversion to contribute to fighting the climate crisis. GGGI works on that in countries like Colombia, where Colombia has a key part of the Amazon, and reducing the deforestation there is a key contribution not only to saving the Amazon, but fighting the climate crisis. That can be done by using an approach that we call the forest economy to develop non-timber forest products and indeed show to the people living in the forest that there are other ways of having a sustainable livelihood than cutting the trees by basically using natural resources sustainably. Korea over the last 2 years has made a significant transition itself, starting with President Moon's announcement that to respond to the pandemic, Korea would use a green and digital New Deal approach in July 2020, and that was followed in October 2020 with a pledge from the President to meet net zero carbon neutrality by 2050. In April this year, but in 2021, the President also committed to end finance for all coal projects internationally, and the Prime Minister's office issued a new policy to significantly increase the green share of Korea's ODA in July last year. In August, the National Assembly adopted a climate neutrality law, only the 14th country to do so, and to increase the ambition for Korea's NDC to 32%. And later, the President committed at COP26 that Korea would increase its NDC ambition to 40%. All those pledges and commitments have made Korea a leader in Asia, and we look forward to see Korea not only implement those promises at home, but convince other countries to join it in fighting the climate crisis. Other countries in Asia that have not yet made the commitments that Korea has made. We're also pleased that the President committed to set up a Korea Green New Deal Fund, a GGGI, to share Korea's leadership, knowledge and technology with other developing countries, and we expect to implement that Korea Green New Deal Fund in this year. So while only the European Union and Korea have formally launched Green New Deals, we believe that Green New Deals have value for emerging and developing economies as well, and particularly that these Green New Deals could generate green jobs, large numbers of green jobs, which is still the priority for almost all developing and emerging economy governments that look to recover from the pandemic. The good news is that switching from fossil fuel to renewable energy not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but also increases the number of green jobs associated with energy by a factor of 2 to 5 if we compare renewable energy and energy efficiently projects with the brown jobs in fossil fuel projects. GGGI continued to look at those opportunities in all of our member countries that had made renewable energy and forestry targets in their NDCs, and we came out with a report last year in August 2020 that showed the potential. The NDC targets for GGGI member countries that were submitted to COP26 were analyzed, and we drew the following conclusions. That in all countries that had clear renewable energy targets, at least 10 million jobs could be generated if those targets were implemented by 2030 in renewable energy. And in the countries that had clear targets in the forestry sector, an even larger number of green jobs could be created in the only 14 GGGI members that had quantifiable targets for forestry in their NDCs. Let me also add that for green job creation, there is a particularly important role for the small and medium enterprises that are the engine for job creation in many countries, and supporting young people, entrepreneurs to set up green businesses is a critically important contribution to the green transition that GGGI works on in many countries. So let me share a few examples of where GGGI collaborates with Korea and Korean ODA organizations to implement projects of the sort that I've just given you examples of. In the Philippines, we have a KOICA-funded program to support small and medium enterprises in the agriculture sector to become more climate resilient and to increase their value add for instance, those calamansi oranges that are grown in Oriental Mindoro, and where we work with those farmers to make their value chains more effective, generating more income and be more climate resilient. In Uzbekistan, we started last year a new program funded by KOICA as well to rehabilitate a significant share of the Aral Sea area in a part of Uzbekistan called Karakalpakstan. We believe that through reforestation and climate smart agriculture, part of that area that has been a disaster zone could be rehabilitated. In Ethiopia, we work on nature-based solutions for climate change, particularly through reforestation, restoration of degraded lands, another project that started last year. In Nepal, we expect to start a new project this year that was proposed to reintegrate economically displaced workers displaced from the Middle East as a result of the pandemic into climate smart agriculture in the low-lying part of Nepal that's called the Tarai floodplain. And a similar program of climate smart agriculture and sustainable value chains we hope to start this year in Senegal. In conclusion, we are living through an unprecedented sustainability crisis. In fact, I believe we are witnessing a planetary emergency. One of the most positive impacts of the increased attention for sustainability worldwide has been the push for carbon neutrality, net zero by 2050, and indeed seeing those promises implemented will be the challenge for the coming year. And I believe powering past coal will be the top priority for Asia. Korea's new commitments is definitely making it a leader in Asia, and I'm hoping that it can persuade other Asian countries to follow its example. And there are important opportunities for Korean Green ODA in its international cooperation. I believe that green job creation, green entrepreneurship should be a very high priority, and that there are low carbon development opportunities in a number of sectors, from buildings to waste to transport and renewable energy, and that there should be an increased attention for climate change adaptation, particularly through nature-based solutions and climate-smart agriculture. Finally, let me say that GGGI is enjoying a strong and growing partnership with Korean ODA organizations, and we stand ready to share Korean knowledge and technology internationally. I thank you.